Ah, and I'm looking straight at the owl. Welcome to everyone who's online, and welcome to everyone who's here in the building for the first of our actual seminars by one of our actual ARC visiting scholars. So it's wonderful to have everyone here today. The visiting scholar in question is MAYRA LÓPEZ-HUMPHREYS, who's the Associate Professor and Director of the BSSW program at the College of Staten Island, and teaches both there and here at the Graduate Center. Her research focuses on restorative approaches with justice-impacted populations, and she's currently the PI on a research project with the Exodus Transitional Community, which studies interventions with with justice-impacted adults transitioning to non-congregate hotel settings. Her work has appeared in the Social Work, the Journal of Social Service Research, and the Journal of Social Work Education and Urban Social Work. What else can I say? She has guided the development of participatory programs and designs and academic community partnerships that endeavor to center the lives of historically stigmatized groups of people. And her topic for today, the islands. Okay, whole title?
It's on the PowerPoint.
It's on the PowerPoint, even better.
It's well, on one. It's one of those academic titles that go on for too long.
Yeah, well, that's okay. She's now going to teach us a lot. Deinstitutional. Well, by the way, were I your editor, that would be the first comment. Anyway, please join us in welcoming Professor LÓPEZ-HUMPHREYS.
Can I take this off?
Yes,
yeah. You have to ask consent nowadays. Good afternoon. It's great to be here. Yes, the title needs some work, but I'll tell you, if you look at any of my titles for my work, none of them are short and sweet, so what I do. Thank you for joining me today for the second Advanced Research Collaborative Seminar. I do not take for granted that you are here at 4 p.m. in the middle of the late afternoon where you could be napping or having a nice glass of wine.
We expect a lot.
But you are here, so thank you.
It is 60 degrees out there, by the way.
We could be at the park. Come on. So thank you for coming. Again, my name is MAYRA Humphreys, and as I shared, I'm an associate professor at the College of Staten Island and also the director of the BSS. For people who may have low vision or blind, I want to just describe myself a little bit for you. I have brown hair, I have brown eyes, I have brown glasses, I have a brown sweater. I have a lot of brown. It's just kind of what I do. Needless to say, that's happening. I'm wearing some burgundy and black weave pants, and I'm a Latina woman. My pronouns are she, her, and behind me is a screen and also some white wall, and yeah, that's a little bit about what's happening with me. So a little bit, both my scholarship and my human work, I like to say, the work that I do that is part of being human. So I don't see them as separate, has focused a lot on academic community partnerships and academic community partnerships that endeavor to really be community-led and centered from and by the voices of people who are often been marginalized from making decisions and actually planning change in their communities. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. During our time together, what I would like to do is examine a little bit about the history of islands in New York with a particular emphasis on Staten Island. Then we'll want to provide a little bit of a literature overview on belonging and community-led change. And I also want to present and discuss the Staten Island Equity and Belonging Project, which has been a wonderful, I say, cross-pollination of community, action work and research coming together in ways that is making all constituents in the project learn more and also be more of who they are. And that's a great thing. So I want to talk a little bit about the inclusion of arts and culture, because this continues to play like a real seminal role in equity work, particularly when you're thinking about justice-centered ways of socially connecting people. That has happened in place-based ways through creative expression. And art and culture expand our epistemology in ways by making knowledge that is usually generally excluded from social change and making it essential to research, to advocacy, to organizing, to living. So the challenge of this is that this knowledge is often, delegitimated or seen as less rigorous, right? Because of the people who are producing it, right? Queer people, people of color, poor people, Black people, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, right? But also because of the ways that they are producing the knowledge, right? So whether it's folk knowledge or family stories or belief systems or songs or experiences or emotions or expressions, these ways of knowing have been subjugated, right? And so we wanna do a lifting of that today and thinking about how we can integrate that into the work that you'll see today. So I thought it would make sense to share with you a poem by he's a friend in my head, but he doesn't know me. But I'd like him to be my friend. He is Jatik Long, and he's a spoken word artist, but he's also a curator and a poet and an activist and just an amazing person. And he's going to share a poem with us today, and then after you hear the poem, we'll talk a little bit about that, okay? Stop the share. Share screen. Share screen, yeah. And then we'll share.
You don't know what it's like to be from Staten Island, the birthplace of the Wu-Tang Clan and the birthplace of tennis in America, yet constantly the butt of the joke, stigmatized both within the borough and externally. It's frustrating that my home is known for stereotypes, caricatures, and the depth of Eric Garner, but not known for Sandy Ground, the oldest free Black settlement in the U.S. and a stop on the Underground Railroad. Why isn't this told? Why isn't it told that we have one of the highest Sri Lankan and Liberian communities outside of their respective countries? It's so upsetting because Staten Island is seen and spoken about in such a polarizing lens that all nuances are lost, which makes it easier to invalidate the problems we face that are uniquely ours, like having the most expensive toll in the country but a lack of quality jobs. To look at Staten Island as a monolith is destructive, especially since it can be seen as a microcosm of the country. But you wouldn't know that unless you look. My name is Jatik Long, proud to call myself a Staten Islander. You don't know what it's like to be from Staten Island.
I'm using this, so it's not working. All right, so in another life, I hope to return with Jatik's flows and skills. I love to listen to people who have that amazing talent with poetry and with rhyme. But I'm sure my 14-year-old son is grateful that I sticking with what I know. so no spoken word career for me. Few artists that you're going to see up here who've painted murals that have to do with different folks on Staten Island, the Wu-Tang Clan. And so we just heard Mr. Long. He told us about the beauty, but also the complexities. He's shared with us a little bit about the harsh realities of Staten Island. And like the prolific Nigerian writer, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who says and warns us that there's a danger of a single story, right? In imposing one story on a people or on a community, right? And Jatik also tells us about the danger of a single story of Staten Island, right? And he says it differently, but he says to look at Staten Island as a monolith is destructive, especially since it can be seen as a microcosm of the country, but you wouldn't know that unless you looked. So the fundamental question of who belongs is an increasingly critical question in every part of the globe. Matters of identity divide societies on every inhabited continent. When we're thinking about identities of religion and ethnicity and skin color and age and politics and sexual orientation and race, among identity groups, these are shaping politics everywhere. And so I'm inviting us to look today, to really look at Staten Island, right? But not as an outlier, not as a geographic space that differs significantly from other cities or from other locales, or is better or worse, but rather as an opportunity to emphasize the importance of understanding the distinct narratives that a geographic space holds. The context, the history, the stories, the emotions, the experiences, the policies, the practices that are often what determine health and well-being for its people. So how do we create an equitable outcome for all members of our community? We can start by defining people by their aspirations and their challenges, and not their challenges. So this is a quote by Travian Shorters. He is a social entrepreneur and a lead thinker in asset framing. And so when I begin these conversations and presentations about the work that I'm doing, I think it's really important. I want to listen to Mr. Long's work. I want to listen to Travian's work and not create a monolith for the Staten Island today. So allow me to share some compelling assets about the history and the current context of Staten Island. Can I do that? All right. So on the southern end of Staten Island, you will find Sandy Ground, a community that was built by Blacks who came to Staten Island decades before the Civil War. And Sandy Ground is one of the oldest continuously inhabited free Black settlements in North America. Sandy Ground is also where the Underground Railroad on the island operated. Staten Island was originally inhabited by tribes from the Lenape Nation. And in our learning and in our community meetings and in our research about Staten Island and with Staten Island, we give respect and acknowledge the original stewards of this land. And so thinking about the land that we're on and who are the people who inhabited it. Staten Island is also the greenest borough with well over 170 parks. So if you get a chance, come on over. 12,300 acres of protected land. I know it full well. There are some days where I'm walking to my car and there is a deer that is escorting me. And it takes a little bit of getting used to, but The parks are all over, and the animals run pretty free. So we also want to talk a little bit about education. So between 2000 and 2017, nearly 90% of Staten Island residents had a high school diploma, the highest share of any borough. And for most of the decade, Staten Island is the fastest growing county in the state of New York. I also want to share with you some really important people who have lived on Staten Island that you may not have known. So Staten Island is also home to one of the most America's earliest and most prolific female photographers, Alice Austin. And Alice Austin, her photography provoked thinking about gender roles, and she openly explored her sexual identity through art. And this was during the 1920s. This is very early on. And now her house is actually a museum. And so you can come and see a lot of the photos. It's a beautiful space. A lot of people work to make that happen. And Audre Lorde, self-described Black, feminist, mother, and poet warrior. I like to say she's a mentor in my head. She also lived on Staten Island. This is her home. And in 2019, New York Landmark Preservation Commission designated Audre Lorde's home as a New York City landmark. So it just happened a couple of years ago. So you've got lots of things to visit when you come and learn about this rich history. Because that feels good to say. Agreed? Those are a lot of beautiful things. And if I could just end my presentation here, and we could all just feel really good, right? Some really great assets that we're talking about. So, equitable community change could happen by solely just identifying and utilizing assets. I would be totally up for it. It would take a lot less courage. It would take a lot less time. But I'm trying to work on being a good ancestor. Right? I'm trying to work on practicing that, right? So I want us to listen to Audre Lorde today and listen to maybe what she would tell us today about what we need to hear as well, right? That she's reminding us that our silences will not protect us, right? That it's not the differences that immobilize us, but silence. And there are so many silences to be broken. So, Miss Lorde from Staten Island, we're listening, right? And we're going to really think about and contend with some of those silences today and see how we can think about what in our imaginations, maybe not in my community, but in your community, how we can do that better so that we can have healthy communities that start with truth-telling. So Staten Island is one of the 4 boroughs that are islands and that are connected to an island. In addition, New York City has well over 42 smaller islands located throughout the boroughs. And so we have a lot of islands. And the water among these surrounding islands have historically served as almost like a moat that, for better or for worse, has secluded its political decision makers from social accountability, has allowed evaded not in my backyard protests by putting things in other places so people won't complain, right? And most importantly, its isolation has served to invisibilize people whose bodies were historically marginalized, exploited, and intentionally excluded from greater society. Right, so we want to look at some of these islands. A number of scholars have argued that islands across New York City have been used to house and exclude undesirables. These bodies have systematically included Black, Indigenous, people of color, immigrants, people with mental and physical disabilities, people who are experiencing homelessness, poverty, or different forms of incarceration, right? And so within the history, we can see these islands being used in many different ways. So we can start by looking at a couple of these islands. Opened in 1825. Opened in 1825 as the first juvenile reformatory in the United States. The House of Refuge was built on Randall's Island. And this reform school housed youth who were deemed like juvenile delinquents that were just unable to function within society, and repeated charges of abuse and neglect and all kinds of disregard, and they would hang the young boys by their thumbs as punishment. A lot of abuse went on for decades. And finally, in 1930, the school was closed. However, this was only because Robert Moses and his city planning wanted to use Randall's Island to create a bridge to other islands. So it's complicated, to say the least. These islands, Randall's Island and Ward's Island, still to today house large mental institutions. Blackwell Island, talk a little bit about that picture over there, currently known as Roosevelt Island, has an extensive history of operating as a prison, a lunatic asylum, a poorhouse, a workhouse for the poor. All of these were notorious for their horrors and their abuses that were committed. Thus, why the name of the island has been changed so many times. So it's been Blackwell Island, Roosevelt Island, Welfare Island. It's been named every time something needed to sort of reboot their identity. By the beginning of the 20th century, prisoners from Blackwell's Island were transferred to Rikers Island and Hart's Island. And the ongoing corruption and horrendous violence on Rikers Island has led to this point for the New York City Council to vote to close down the facility by 2026. So people from Blackwell's Island were brought to Rikers Island, and now this island is being supposedly closed by 2026. So that's a little overview of islands on New York and some of the ways that that have been attributed to geographic space. Similar inhumane conditions have existed on Staten Island's unoccupied land. So at any point, if folks want to ask a question or talk to me, I'm good with that. Like, call and response, I'm all about that. So don't feel in any way like you'll disrupt my flow. I like a good question. So Staten Island, unoccupied lands, it's limited infrastructure. So it's not until the late 1960s that it actually gets the Verrazano Bridge. So before that, there's very few ways to get in and out of the island, right? And so this limited infrastructure gives way to one of the largest mental institutions in the history of the United States, the Willowbrook State School. How many of you have heard of the Willowbrook State School? Okay, so our campus currently is on the Willowbrook State School. So it is very visceral for us to think about we are living in that history. And what does it mean for the work that we do and how we serve people at our college who have disabilities and how we think about access. So it's very poignant for us. Say a little bit about that. The institution was notoriously known for inconceivable horrors. I can send you a few links to, I did not want to do that today. I would have to give you a trigger alert because they really are some horrendous pictures towards children, adults with disabilities. And in 1987, finally, after many, many decades, years, the uncovering of these atrocities led to state-led reforms and eventual closing of the Willowbrook State School. Now, throughout the US, the closing of the Willowbrook State School, because it was the largest, was instrumental in the movement of deinstitutionalization across the United States. So it did really, become the catalyst for that. Unknown to many who were at the Willowbrook State School, African Americans and Puerto Rican residents constituted the largest Black and Brown population of that mental health system, of any mental health facility in New York. So at Willowbrook, an overwhelming number of residents were African American and Puerto Rican, and this was more than any other mental health facility in New York. So just again, making some of those connections of intersectionality and how things sort of deepen in ways that only happen because of that lens. And so we'll look a little bit at that. So the campus of College of Staten Island is also the former site of the Willowbrook State School. The impact of Staten Island's history continues to transform into modern day stigmas and inequities for people experiencing social and economic marginalization. And many of these inequities are mediated through its geography. So the divide between Staten Island's north and south shore runs deep, so deep that residents will refer to the borough's expressway as the Mason-Dixon line. Just let that sink in. The Othering and Belonging Institute Inclusiveness Index is a diagnostic tool designed to measure inclusivity and marginality across geographic space, but also look at social dimensions. And so that index tool has been very helpful for us in understanding the breadth and depth of these inequities. And so the index uses 6 domains that can determine how historically stigmatized groups within a community fare in relationship to the following domains. So the index looks at income inequality, out-group violence, rates of incarceration, immigration policy, anti-discrimination law, and political representation. Okay, and so these are the areas that we then looked at for our study. We began to look at just qualitatively see happening on Staten Island. So longstanding barriers to equity and belonging that continue to exist on Staten Island are evident when considering the domains of the index. So I thought I would just share a few examples with you. Okay. So a few examples with you. So we'll look at income inequality. So the North Shore is the poorest district and has one of the lowest rates of labor participation in New York City. 73% of North Shore residents are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Among New York City's 5 boroughs, Staten Island residents with disabilities have the highest employment gap and the lowest ridership of public transportation. And this is important because if you don't have a good public transportation system, then it's hard to get a good job, right? It's all connected, especially if you have challenges with movement and your body moves in ways that you need additional support, right? So then if I have to wait for the accessor ride and my job starts at 9, but the accessor ride doesn't get here until 8:45, now I'm late, difficulties keeping jobs, I can't go off the island because that would be even more difficult. So there's real challenges that are intersecting in structures for people with disabilities. And also for people who are experiencing low income. These are also challenges. If you don't have a car on the island, how are you going to work? Where are you going to work? So in 1920, Staten Island saw 18 hate crime incidents, an increase of 8 compared to 2019. In all other boroughs, the number of hate crime incidents had decreased. In the past, I should also note, like, these were tumultuous political years, right? So that this is another backdrop to a lot of the tension that happens on the island. In the past 50 years, Staten Island has elected one Black and one Latinx resident to public office. In all other New York City boroughs, the number of BIPOC elected officials has increased fourfold since 1969. So a little bit about immigration policies. 48% of undocumented immigrants hold temporary jobs on Staten Island, and 45% provide childcare services or maintenance work in private homes in Staten Island. So a lot of work that is off the books, a lot of work that can be, fire at will, all of that kind of. Most do not qualify for health insurance, unemployment insurance, family leave, sick leave, and workers' compensation laws. So let's look a little bit at anti-discrimination laws. So the current residential zoning laws prohibit attached low-cost housing. So you also can't utilize your basement or your top floor or a carriage house as a form and rent it out. Everything has to be single-family home on the South Shore. So what this does is hundreds of Staten Island residents who have disabilities and are aging out, because many of them are, they don't have places to live. Also, people who are of low income and would like to move to other parts of the island are relegated to the North Shore because there is no housing on the South Shore. So it's also important to note that the Staten Island St. Patrick's Day Parade continues to ban LGBTQ residents from marching openly as a community within the parade. So, rates of arrest and incarceration. In 2019, the marijuana arrests made by the North Shore's 120th precinct, the precinct area where Eric Garner was murdered in 2014, has far outpaced the rest of the borough and most of New York City. So I think it's important to then bring this full circle to talking about, of course, the life and death of Eric Garner. In 2014, Staten Island received widespread attention when Eric Garner, a 43-year-old father of 6, a Black male, and North Shore resident, was tragically killed in an act of homicide by a white New York City police officer. Garner's identities as a Black man contending with employment discrimination and a person disabled by obesity and chronic asthma is a tragic confirmation of the pressing need to address the intersectional effects of structural racism, classism, and ableism on Staten Island. This is what really catapulted our work, was thinking about how we could honor and create change in the legacy of Eric Garner. So when we're considering these intersecting complex inequities and unjust barriers to well-being, just checking my time. Okay. We would be remiss if we predicted. It wants to talk to you. It needs to talk to you now. It sounds like my 14-year-old son when he calls. Persistent. Okay. We would miss a lot if we predicted that resolving these intersecting inequities would simply that resolving these inequities would simply be about just fixing the issues and undoing barriers, right? Just removing some barriers. So one of the things we think about is, okay, we'll see. So one of the things we do on our work, and as we're thinking about change that we want to make, we ask ourselves not only like, what are the barriers that we want to see removed, but we're asking ourselves, what harms do historically stigmatized bodies experience from systems? And how do we know it's happening and where do we see it, right? Because these things can often be insidious and harder to identify, right? So what are these, how do systems stigmatize people, and how are we a part of it in the work that we do, whether intentionally or unintentionally, right? So, so when I think about, you know, the work that I do and helping students, and when COVID hit and so many students didn't have a place to learn, they were with cameras in their bathrooms and in their TVs and in their showers, and so embarrassed, and they didn't want to put their camera on, but then teachers were failing them because they didn't want to put their camera on, and having to have meaningful conversations with people about what are we not seeing, right? Because often when we don't have those experiences, we think we have a dominant narrative that tells us people are just not trying. But what if there's more? And how do we learn the more? And how do we ask good questions so that we can do it better? So what's missing and getting in the way? Because we can remove barriers, we can give people Wi-Fi access, but we can't give people an apartment, right? So the challenge is that these structural issues are really deep. And so we have to think about that when we're thinking about how it impacts the work that we're doing in whatever way we're doing it, especially during these COVID times. So here we have a typical healthy communities map. I hope you can read it. You can see kind of how this map is identifying what this neighborhood needs in order to be healthy, right? Anything that you think is important up here that you see?
Can't read it.
Can't see it?
All of it.
But the picture helps.
Yeah, it's green and sustainable development practices, environmental quality, safe neighborhood, public spaces.
I had today an interview with a Hispanic community in Bronx, and we spoke about that because, and he says one of our main purpose for this for the new government in New York was that they must understood that health is much more than physical.
Exactly.
And we wanted that they do policies taking into account that the health policy is not only about health.
Exactly.
And we wanted to, it is in my interview, it is already recorded, and they say also, we want also that all the statistics, all the data be improved in these terms. And I was, wow, good. I think it's a good place.
So yeah, so community health community health, thinking about like healthy community, the field of community health is really big right now. And I think it's great. I think it's really important. I think leaders in change who strive to create, resilient, equitable, healthy communities, they think about food, they think about clean air and water, they think about, safe public spaces, they think about, environmental quality. However, social connection is often excluded from priorities of healthy communities, despite its vital connection and contribution to health and well-being.
What was number 7? Completeness of neighborhoods?
So completeness of neighborhood. So it could mean, I don't have it all up here, but it could mean like, that the neighborhood has the resources that it needs, like it's, it's able to, care for itself in terms of infrastructure and things that it needs. Yes. But we've been really interested in what is it about initiatives that, we're not looking at the importance and the vitality that comes from social connection and how we can augment it and how we can support it and also foster it through public infrastructure, right? So Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, defines social capital as the connections among individuals, social networks, and the norms of reciprocity and trustworthiness that arise from them. So, right, we all know Putnam, wonderful thinking on, the importance of social connections and how these social connections, when you have less of them, you become more isolated and, right, the whole, therefore, bowling alone, right? So, lack of significant connections interpersonally and within the community is becoming a health crisis. People don't have relationships that are robust, that are, I talk to people and I ask them, do you have 3 friends if you got sick that you could call and ask you to bring soup? That to me is always the litmus, right? And people will tell me, well, my mom, no, not your mom. She's great, but 3 friends, and not the delivery person, right? But do you have? So I think that's the kind of cultivation that we're thinking we want to see included in healthy communities. How do we get people to think about pods, right? Like communities you don't choose, but that choose you because of proximity. And you work together to think about the things that you can help each other with together. And so yeah, that was really interesting to me when I asked that question and people couldn't answer. I said, and don't tell me your friends on Instagram or Facebook, they're not bringing you anything.
What did they say about their neighbors?
They're sending you an emoji soup. There's not much of a response. Like it's like, oh, there's a real lack of that. I think it's just endemic to what has been happening for quite some time with the erosion of social connections. So I think the Healthy Community Initiative is a great way to bring that back, to think not only of infrastructure and systems, but also to think about rehumanizing relationships in ways that keep people healthy. So thank you for that. That was good. So policies that ignore inquiries about the impact of harm on bodies can miss a lot. So when we look at policies and we simply think, let's just remove barriers, and we don't think about the impact on bodies, we don't think of the impact on, relationships between bodies and structures, we can miss a lot. So I wanted to give you an example. So for example, we've had a number of people who've asked me in our project, not fellows in our project, but people outside of our project, like, why don't you do a campaign on like getting affordable housing on the South Shore, right? And changing some of the housing policies there, right? So let's take that through. Okay, let's take that through. So if we lobbied, advocated, and were successful in changing local exclusionary laws, zoning laws, rules that prohibit homeowners from using their basement or their top, and we were able to do that. We were successful, right? Now, that policy change is huge, right? But solely to look at that policy change and could do some things. It could expand housing on the South Shore. It may create opportunities to collect diverse people together, right? May bring some additional diversity into the community. However, the qualities of those relationships between those who were there and those who are new depends on a lot of other invisible factors. So public health researchers confirm the importance of these invisible factors. The literature argues that toxic, uncontrollable stress by feeling a lack of control, safety, or peace in one's community, like the uncontrollable and persistent stress that comes from the awareness of danger when interacting with the police. If Another, if you are vigilant against someone being rude to you at the cash register in your neighborhood that you go to every week, and you're trying to figure out if it's because of your race or your gender, then your body is constantly feeling it, and it's feeling that it needs to prepare every time it goes to ShopRite. Or consider the following. Or take the or think of the experience of taking the public bus daily for work and seeing the faces of annoyance and the rolled eyes and the heavy sighs that people give you because they're required to wait for the wheelchair lifts to come down and the bus driver to come out and assist you in accessing transportation, right? Now, when you think about that, it's very easy to think, oh, that's just people behaving badly, right? Because I just talked about situations that seem to be, right, between people. Can anyone think about how they're not just between people? What else is happening structurally and, within the environment that may impact that toxic stress?
Buses aren't coming frequently enough.
There you go. Exactly. So the buses aren't going frequently enough. So now you're coming on the bus, you're making me late. I already had to wait for the other bus, right? So there are these, infrastructure realities that then increase, disbelonging for people who actually need it most, right? Thinking about, people and the interaction with police. Some people are asking for the police to come in, right? While others are triggered by that, right? So what does that mean? When people are living in the same community but have different experiences about policing. Yeah, how well do you know me and how can I feel like I belong here when you really don't understand what this feels like for me, right? So these are issues that are not about desegregating policies. These are issues about social connection and how we create that within the work that we do to think about change. So deeply entangled, not only in historical conditions, but in current conditions are profound questions about belonging and not belonging, and how it is enacted and experienced and its effects on the implications for intentionally excluding communities. So I'm going to look through a few different disciplines and their work on belonging. This is like multidisciplinary right now. People are doing a lot of work on it. So scholarship in medical anthropology and in social sciences and humanities has shown numerous ways in which belonging and not belonging are intimately tied to well-being and health. In psychology, belonging and the need to belong is described as the fundamental human need, drive, and desire. It's akin to the need for food and water. So in psychology, they're sort of rearranging the whole Maslow's hierarchy and thinking about like how belonging fits in that. Yuval Davis, a sociologist, differentiates between how people belong and the politics of a belonging that arise when different social groups interact. Belonging, whether at the level of the collective or the individual, is never free of dynamics of power. So they're interested in seeing how that plays politically. In disability studies, embodied belonging is used to show and describe how bodies, things, place, space intersect in complex ways to produce feelings of belonging and not belonging. Embodied belonging connects social, moral, and political, legal aspects of belonging with its affective and tactual dimensions. And so within our work, we use an embodied belonging framework because we think it captures a lot of what we're looking to cultivate. So The Othering and Belonging Institute also has some great work on belonging, and they look at belonging in terms of systems and structures that shape communities, and how systems and structures also have responsibility to convey belonging. So belonging is more than just a feeling included. In a healthy and thriving society, belonging means that your well-being is considered and your ability to design and give meaning to its structures and institutions is realized. So now this is moving from just, I feel good, right? This is not just a belonging like, you know, kumbaya, right? This is a deep kind of belonging of people's culture, identity, stories being woven into, right, a community's life. And we can think of many reasons how that can be challenging, right? For people to understand the importance of. So belonging tells us something fundamental about how groups are structurally positioned within a society. And it also tells us how they are understood and regarded. So it's a wonderful lens to see like what we talk about of like who's in and who's out and where are people positioned, right? And this experience has deep affective components to it. This is not just about, you know, who picked me on the playground, right? This is much deeper than that, right? So there's a fundamental sense of like how groups are structurally positioned in society and how they are regarded. And there is some affective pieces to this because belonging interventions not only communicate that someone belongs, but it shapes how they feel about and regard the thing that they belong to, right? It's iterative, it's coming back and forth, right? So it's not only about, you know, the intervention creating some belonging, but it's also about the person and how they experience that belonging. So how do we create culture, ideology, and interactions with institutions, with systems and policies that connect people to their deep sense of belonging? How do we do that? Is that possible? How do we create structures that say, we see you, we hear you, and you belong? That's what we've been asking ourselves. That's our work. So we've used this model as a way of thinking about, okay, what are the social structures? What are the cultural structures? And like, what do we see that is belonging in these spaces and not in these? And it's a great way for communities to ask themselves about belonging. Unfortunately, the importance of attending to social and relational spaces that give internal meaning to life are overlooked and often dismissed. We said that a little bit earlier. Public institutions and systems like school, social services, houses, transportation, workspaces, even established forms of creative placemaking. They spend a lot of time on transactional solutions and not enough time on thinking about structures and social and relational outcomes, which are more transformational, right? We think a lot of transactional ways to address issues, and that's why we can't just have city planners doing the work. We need community people, right? So transactional work. So, you know, creating an accessibility map of the ramps that are in this area. Well, that doesn't help me if there aren't enough ramps. So you can tell me where they are, but it doesn't help me to get better accessibility, right? So we get caught in these transactional ways of addressing belonging that often don't really address the condition, right? Or making one bathroom in a specific mall that is, gender neutral, right? And it's the only bathroom that's gender neutral. So, great, it's a bathroom, but it's one, right? So even in the way we think about infrastructure, it's still isolating. It's still minimal. It's still conveying, right? Something different than you belong, we see you, right? Something very different is being conveyed than you belong here, right? Or we're gonna put the bathroom, in the bottom floor, right? All of these things that we've seen happen, how we try to be politically correct in the ways that will cause the least protest possible, right? So disproportionate attention to transactional solutions and not enough to transformational solutions. As a form of embodied belonging, as a form of embodied belonging, we're gonna look a little bit at how structural belonging is part of that embodied belonging and what that looks like. So we're all situated within structures, but not evenly, right? And structures are not neutral. Oftentimes we think they're neutral. So we treat spaces as just they are. So what would you like people to do? It's the only way you can get in. Or, I know you don't feel safe walking down that street, but that's the street you walk. Make sure you don't dress provocatively, right? So structures are what they are, and we make them neutral in ways that don't see people, right? Structural belonging, scholars argue that marginalization and exclusion are not primarily produced in individual encounters, but are really the result of structural causes. So fostering belonging is not merely about transactional solutions. It's about creating a checklist of quotas, or doing a DEI training, one and done, or inviting trans people or people of color to the proverbial table. How many of you have, had the opportunity to be at one of those wonderful tables that you get invited to? We think that's a form of increasing belonging. But I do want to challenge that many groups require more than just access. They require accommodations that transform conditions. And that's important to note because integration is necessary, but not always sufficient. And many groups require more than access, more than being invited to the table. They require distinct accommodations that transform conditions. And so when we think about that, that might mean belonging, if it's both transactional and transformational, maybe it's building a table together. Or maybe it's building something totally different that's not a table. Maybe it's yoga mats and sensory swings and some standing desks, and it's going to look a little, it's not going to look unified in the way that we like our worlds to look, right? It's going to be a little quirky. It's going to be a little messy when we want to create belonging for everyone so that we can do this in a way that rehumanizes relationships and also provides support that people need to thrive, okay? Because the one table is not going to cut it. We need to think about other ways. And so how do we, hold less value to the artifacts and really center the people so that we can work on what could it be now that we come around. Right? Okay. So I'll talk a little bit about sustainable conditions for social change. So understanding the importance of building a culture of belonging. So we talked about structural belonging, but I also think it's important to note that building a culture of belonging is also very key in the work that we do. And in our project, that's been a big part of what we've been doing, right? So thinking about deep engagement with range of diverse stakeholders. There's a few things that, when you're thinking about culture and why it's important to create it, it's because we know that everyone has that, right? People come with that. And if you invite them, they can give you and inform with that. If we make it about other, people may not have, whether it's education or different kinds of education they may have, more informal. If we make it about, monies, or we make it, but culture is something that we can all come around and express our belonging through. So people largely organize themselves around stories and beliefs, not around facts. We know this, right? If you know about the elections that just happened, about vaccinations, people do not organize themselves around around facts. It's around stories and beliefs. It's around memes. It's around quick, right? So we've got to then find a way to create true stories that are even more compelling than dominant narratives that are saying things that are not the truth, but are the dominant stories, right? So a culture of belonging coalesces community power through culture, art, and story to shift public sentiment and forge a new collective consensus around a problem, a social problem or issue. So that brings us to our project that I'm going to share a little bit with you. So understanding the importance of culture, of belonging that can sustain structural change, this has profoundly informed the blueprint of the Staten Island Equity and Belonging Project. And the Staten Island Equity and Belonging Project really emerged from knowing that there were so many wonderful, thriving constellations of advocacy work that's happening for people with historically stigmatized identities on the island. So people who were doing work with people with disabilities, and other folks were doing work on Black Lives Matter, and other people were doing work with undocumented immigrants, and other folks were doing environmental justice work. And we're like, when do people get together? Because we're all working for the people. So how does this become a we, right? And some of that has been a challenge, I think, because island geography creates island ways of isolation. And so helping people to think outside of their particular north, south, mid, and think about working together across to ask ourselves, what can we do together that we cannot do alone? And that's been our mantra together. What is it that we need each other for? Because if we can figure that out, then we can really build relationships. And if we can build relationships, then we can sustain culture. If we can sustain culture, then we can develop conditions, right? All connected. So Staten Island, we wanted to bring together folks together to cultivate collaborations that could serve to develop a strategic meta-narrative that could strengthen social connections across diverse stakeholders for the express purpose of creating conditions to sustain equity and belonging on Staten Island. And so I'm going to skip that. This is a little bit, so this is what we asked ourselves: what spaces exist to collaboratively cultivate partnerships that foster belonging and seek to undo the harms impacting historically marginalized populations on Staten Island. So that's where we began. And in the summer of 2020, the Staten Island Equity and Belonging Project was initiated. And we did that with the sponsorship of the Department of Social Work, the Rivera Fund for Social Work and Disability Studies, and also from a grant from the Council on Social Work Education. A colleague of mine in my department, Dr. Paul Archibald, in partnership with several community organizations, so we had about 6 or 7 organizations come from the start, and then community leaders from the start. So the development came from people coming together from different paths of community change work. And there are two parts today I want to share with you. The first part is the Public Conversations for Change Fellows. So the Public Conversations for Change Fellows started in October 20th. This is our second year as a space for civic dialogue and for creating transformative change, social change on Staten Island. Now, the PCCLF initiative, it works like a community of practice, which means we are learning together, then practicing those skills, and then coming together to think about what does it mean for the work that we would like to do and see on Staten Island. So it is not a training, it is not a one and done, it's a year commitment, and folks are invited to come back the year after and continue the projects, because the projects continue to emerge, evolve into different things. So we have a broad group of stakeholders, over 75 people who have participated last year. We have another cohort this year, nonprofit leaders, neighborhood activists, human service professionals, teachers, self-advocates, college students, working together. And the fellows, I want to tell you a little bit about what they've explored together in our work together. So part of the work is we are not only like inviting people to learn the skills, but also to practice the skills. That's a community of practice. So we taught community circles, and we also asked people to then practice community circles in their prospective spaces. Circles were around different questions like, where have you felt belonging on Staten Island? Where haven't you? What would you like to see different? Who has been part of that? So these kind of story circles were going around. We taught them community mapping in many different ways, from using a Jamboard to using sophisticated GIS systems to using paper and marker. Basically, if you want to know how many, access, how many train stations or buses are accessible, they go around and look, and then they count them, and then they draw something, right? So different groups did it in different ways, and the whole point of it was to do it in a way that was engaged in the community and that was not deficit centered, right? So that it was looking at affirmative inquiry. What can we see that we can build on? And how can we use that in the work that we're doing? We offered an open source toolkit that people could share with their residents, with their friends, with their organizations. And then in the end, they created a how might we question, which was, well, there's a couple. So every pod decided on a question, yes.
Can you tell us about the toolkit?
Yes, so I can actually share it with you too. So it's an open source toolkit. The toolkit has everything from trainings that we have to a whole historical section on Staten Island, so people could learn about Staten Island and understand it. We have a section on tools for advocacy. We also have a section on resources that people could access of people on the island. So everything is hyper local. And meant to be specifically for folks who are living on the island, which didn't exist. So we had all of these New York City lists that didn't mean much to folks who are on the island. So working on that as well. That's a good question. Thank you. And we also had diagnostic tools in there and assessment tools that we had gone through that they could use in their organizations and in their work. And then we taught them how to imagine, right? And we asked them, how might we, if your pod could come together, how might we blank? Tell us what you want to change together that you've been thinking about after you've done your story circles, your community mapping, and reflecting on who you are. Like, what can your pod do together? So connected through relationship and learning from the community, and then going into, okay, so what can we do together that we cannot do alone? And so people came up with amazing proposals. And we call those proposals beautiful solutions. And I'll share with you a few of them if I have time. If I don't, I'm sorry. But I do want to share a little bit about the process of the PCCLF and why that makes it so special. In the PCCLF, you know, we often well, I don't know how many of you belong to coalitions or you belong to any kind of, you know, community development project. We talk strategy and transaction all day long, right? And because of that, we don't have the relationships to sustain the work that is freaking hard, right? Because this work is exhausting. And doing it in community is, you know, it's thankless sometimes. If you're expecting for people to appreciate you and be glad you're there, you know what I mean? There's a lot of trauma people are working through. And so this work takes a lot of sustainment and commitment because it's beautiful and it's rewarding, but it also has to happen outside of transaction and strategy. We have to come and show up as humans. We have to be human in this work because if not, like we just can't sustain ourselves. And what happens is with a lot of the work, I see it all the time, people burn out, they get tired, they get frustrated, and then they're like, I'm going to be about me. And so we go from one extreme to the other. So part of what we're working to is to talk about like, what does it mean for community care? Not just self-care, not a bubble bath, but like, how do we care for each other as a community? And what is possible within our infrastructures that could help that could affirm that we need that, right? So whether it's, you know, free spaces to, you know, have picnics or to bring out your own furniture and sit in the park if you wanted to, right? Different things that allow people to just care for themselves. Really important, and build relationship. So focus on this, you know, everything we do is through relationship and structure, process, and all of that. It's important, but this stuff, relationship, identity, and stories is just as important. So it's about that both and coming together in the work. And that's what makes the project so powerful because people are personally transformed as well as working to create community transformation. I could tell you a little bit about the Equity and Belonging Survey. I don't know how much time I have. Let me know.
Might want to try to wrap it up in the next 5 minutes.
Can do that. Okay. So this is the second part of our project has been second part of our project has been the survey, the borough-wide survey, and this survey has been running for a year, and it's to better understand the perceptions and awareness on equity, on belonging at the intersections of class, race, ethnicity, and disability. When we started this project, we were looking for research that had done any kind of assessment or had any kind of conversation qualitatively, anecdotally with people to understand what was their experience. There had been so much that had happened on this island. How are people processing it? And there was nothing. And so we were like, well, we've got to create something. You know, we want to know, like, how are people experiencing these things, and also begin that conversation so that people can build on that research as well. So that was how the poll, the borough-wide poll was initiated. And our study questions are, what are residents' attitudes and perceptions about disability, race, and politics? What are Staten Island residents' awareness of privilege and oppression? To what extent do residents experience a sense of community on Staten Island? Is there a relationship between the attitudes and perceptions about disability, race, and politics and the sense of community experienced by former or current residents of Staten Island? And how do Staten Island residents define a sense of community? So those are our research questions. And it's a descriptive study, and it's an anonymous online survey distributed through Qualtrics. And current convenience sample right now of 854. And we're still collecting data. So if you know people in Staten Island, share. Staten Island residents were recruited by our community groups and organizations, as well as social media groups. So we went to the most conservative to the most liberal Staten Island social media groups, and we just kind of reached out to everyone to try to get as many people to answer and respond. Criteria to participate in the study: you had to live or work in the borough, or you could be a former resident who lived in the borough for 1 year in or more in the last 10 years, and you had to be at least 18, and you have to be at least 18 years old. Not going to go through the measures, but we have over 6 measures that are measuring things from explicit disability attitudes, awareness of sexism, heterosexism, classism, racism, perceptions on race, religion, politics, sense of community. So 6 open-ended questions that ask people about belonging. Where do they feel a sense of belonging? What gave them that belonging? And if they didn't feel it, what could give them that belonging? And then demographics. So I'm working with the lovely Becca, who's probably online. She's cleaning the data, and she really wanted to give you something today. She's so kind. We just started like cleaning data. So this is just some of the preliminary demographic data that we have for the study. I know you can't read that, so but I can send it in your PowerPoint if you'd like to. But basically, there is variation in some places and in others less so. That's why we're still collecting. So an analysis strategy, again, descriptive statistics, bivariate analysis is going to be employed to determine the relationship between variables such as residents on Staten Island and the extent of awareness of privilege and oppression. Multivariate analysis will be employed to explain the variance among variables, such as factors that influence attitudes and perceptions about disability. Exciting for me is we're going to do some geo-enrichment software where we'll use that to enhance our data analysis by allowing, it would allow us to get additional data for context. So for example, we could do a social equity analysis that would incorporate our survey data and aggregate it into geographic reporting areas and calculate a community condition rate for each given geography. So we're excited about that. Yeah.
So are you doing this survey only in the north of Staten Island?
Whole, north and south.
And
mid.
So how would the white resident voting for Trump be appealed to take part in the survey?
We have them. I mean, because the way that we presented it was like, great. Yeah, tell us, you know, I mean, I want that. Like, what I think we're having more trouble with is getting people on the North Shore that are second language learners that are not necessarily, literate. So we're trying to figure that out because we want to capture that. But people tell you what they think.
Okay. For better and for worse.
Yes, which is what we want, because at the end, it's an open source tool that will say, who will we become? Ask ourselves, is this what we want, or do we want, to do better? So it does create some positive pressure when people start to have to see it, right? And know what it looks like. Some of the beautiful solutions I just wanted to share with you. So our pods this year continue the work of pods that were working in the fellows last year. One pod is working on language access on Staten Island, so creating, a place where people can come and get language access resources if their organization doesn't offer it, that they could provide it or give them contacts, as well as providing resources for how they could interpret different, ways of communicating within their organizations, and making it important for folks to know that language access is not just about someone who speaks the language, that you should also be thinking about people who understand the culture. So it's very different. So having people who could, you know, be broad in their ability to provide language access. Promoting an equitable transportation system. So this group is doing a photo voice project with folks who take the transportation, who are speaking about their experiences and what that has meant to them, and the challenges, but also the opportunities, and also the distinctions in different kinds of transportation that exist on the island. So people who take the express bus have a lot more better things to say than people who take the public bus, right? And so it's a project where they're really curating the voices. Awareness campaign on invisible disabilities is a campaign working with organizations and businesses that want to make their employees and their staff more aware that disabilities are not just always ones that you see, but that there's a lot of neurological and other disabilities that you don't know of, and how you can be supportive as an organization in that. And then offering them place cards and posters that could be put around, and disability advocate commitment cards. And so they're working on that. Those are a few, there's a few more, but they're beautiful projects, they really are. And so some are working on the public parks and using them to host wellness, communal fridges, gardens, story mapping, belonging project that our pod is doing to map the stories of belonging in Staten Island. So that's our beautiful solutions in the making. And I thought that'd be a great note to end on. Any questions?
Should we go to gallery view so we can see what the other people say?
That is a lot.
We've got a couple minutes for questions. Questions and comments in the room and at home.
Should I say what's happening in the chat?
Just a question about I have many questions, but I feel we have not time, but just one, because the project is about equity and belonging. And then I just wonder if you can tell us what does equity, the role of equity in your work, and the relation between equity and belonging, which seems to me conceptually interesting.
Yeah, so that's why when we talk about, we put them together, because I don't think they're necessarily dichotomous. I do think that sometimes one can happen without the other. So we're thinking about what does it look like when it comes together. So equity is about, you know. But
you assume that more equity and more belonging?
Do I assume that?
If equity and belonging are together as a positive relation, or not necessarily? This is what I was wondering behind.
Yes. So that they work together, so that, you know, as you increase forms of equity and access, and people have, and that not only just forms of access, but access that is accommodating to people, right? And they're specific, so we call it targeted universalism, right? Where what do you need to get to school? Everyone needs to get to school, right? But you may need more things than someone else to get to school. But it is about everyone getting to school, right? So that's the definition of equity that we look to support, right? That it's not about, you know, giving everybody the same, but it's about giving everyone what they need so that they can do the things that everyone is striving to do. And the second piece with belonging is that you can do those things and still that social connection piece, I'm going to go back to that, if people don't feel socially connected to each other, if people don't share narratives, if people don't have relationships, if they're not well networked, then people don't have a sense that you see me, I'm here, you belong. So there are different parts. One is more affective in what we feel when we walk into a space, right? We've all done it, right? We walked into a space and we're like, oh, I don't know if I want to be here. I don't know, when is my friend coming, right? And you don't know what it's a feeling. That's how we work as humans. So how do we become intentional curators and realizing what's creating feeling? Is it the music? Is it that we start right on time and other people come late and they feel bad? Like, so the idea is like becoming like really curious about culture so that you can create belonging and not just equity, but both like deepen
because the beautiful
process.
solutions are all related to equity.
I didn't hear that, sorry.
No, all the beautiful solutions are related to equity.
Well,
Most
not
of them.
not necessarily, you know, both and, like, you know, the Photo Voice project is really about having people share their stories and, you know, what they need to belong and what are the ways that they've experienced that. So the form of how they're doing the work is also part of the belonging as well, you know? So they may be doing things that are addressing equity, but how they're doing it are ways that are connected to culture and art and relationship. Yeah.
Question. So, you mentioned that you know, existing large immigrant communities in Staten Island, and I assume, maybe wrongly, that they have very strong networks within the community. But I guess one of the interventions is to try and encourage belonging, right, across communities. But I'm wondering if you're also building on existing networks, existing structures within communities, and could you maybe talk a little bit about that?
So we talked a lot about that too, because again, that dichotomization always happens, right? Like people need spaces where they can feel at home and feel affirmed and known, right? And so yes, people need their Sri Lankan communities, and people need their, you know, their Mexican grocer, and they need, right? Those things are beautiful, and other people want to join and learn. Great. So that's a piece of belonging, like, you know, caring for those spaces and uplifting those spaces and seeing those spaces as legitimate parts of neighborhoods, even though in other neighborhoods they may just be perfunctory. Right? So doing that, so lifting, that's about the narrative telling again, right? It's about like, how do we, so we've done like, one of our folks, Arlette, is amazing. She's a photographer. She's done art on, you know, the beauty of the North Shore, and she's put the art in laundromats on the North Shore, right? Because that's where it's accessible and that's where people can enjoy. So it's gonna look different, hyper local. But I think, what was the second part of your question? Yes.
Are you building on those existing networks to integrate?
So that's one piece, right? So, and then the other piece is what you know, a lot of researchers would call like third spaces, right? And that's the part that we know is more difficult, right? Because that requires infrastructure and city planning and doing more of that. Like, how do we create third spaces that are intentionally designed for people to come together who wouldn't any other way? And a lot of that could happen through the arts, again, through the parks that they have. Those assets are just amazing. So that's what we've been thinking about, right? Strengthening the spaces, the cultural spaces, and also thinking about how we can create third spaces that really inspire people to want to connect.
Like in relation to those third spaces, like I know you talked a little bit about social media, but in what I've been seeing, like in Singapore, for example, with COVID, because everyone's been stuck at home, the third space really became the online space, right? And people really did come together across different coalitions in these spaces. And I was wondering if that's also something that you've been seeing over the past couple years.
I don't think we would have been as successful our first year if we were in person. Like I think that was, not only that, because it became a neutral space, because there was so much about, is it going to be on the North Shore? Is it going to be in the mid? Why does the college have to host it? The college is in the middle, which is another, it's just funny. It's funny. It's not in the mid. Yeah. So we hold the middle in many ways, metaphorically. So, that would become a contention. So it was great to be online because people showed up, in ways that this year we're thinking about doing some hybrid and doing both and we're going to try and see how that works. But this has been really good. You're absolutely right. It gave us some good traction and momentum.
May also have increased your response rate, if only because people are bored.
I'll take it.
Yeah, they're sitting around at home, it's a good time to get online.
Hey.
I was interested though,
But the thing is that's been wild is that people come with their kids. Like
Right.
we've made it such a friendly space,
Yeah.
this is not your office. This is about relationship building. So we start off with breathing exercises, we read poem, we go into our, our arguments, our brave space. We have rituals that keep us, it's not a meeting. It really is a community coming together to do this work. So I think rituals are really important in that, because then you can bring kids into that and you can bring, they can do it with you. So we're like, yeah, bring them.
Okay, well, we're a little bit over time, but I want to thank you again for a really fascinating time. And perhaps,
Should I go to the
all right,
questions?
you can take, why don't you take that?
Lorianne, you have a question?
Hi, nice to see you, Dr. Humphreys. It's been a while. So my question is, so you spoke a little bit about it for a second, and it's something that I'm interested in, the role of the university. CSI likes to talk about how it's the anchor institution on Staten Island and it's committed to borough stewardship. And I'd love to know what you think about the role of the university, or maybe the responsibility of researchers in fostering a sense of belonging on the island.
Yeah,
Too bad.
I think that's a great question. I mean, what we've tried to do is get investment from faculty and students and staff so that they could voice that within the PCCLF. So I think that has a really important role. We just need people to do that work with us. Does that make sense?
Yes. Also, yes, and I'm wondering, how is there a way? Is there something that we're missing of kind of gaining that support within the university for the work that you're doing and that's already being done across the island? Because I feel like there's still so much isolation within the university itself and these silos, and I'm still kind of thinking through the ways of how we can kind of break through that to bridge those gaps in this kind of work.
Lorianne, I think I hear a pod in you. You've got to come back. Yeah, I think that's great work that we've been talking about. Like Paul and I have been saying, we'd love to get like a pod of college stakeholders who want to really be intentional about moving this within the institution, because it just can't be me or Paul or students, because they're new to this and they're here to learn. So that's been a little bit of a challenge. But I'm open to ideas. I think that is definitely something that's needed.
Thank you.
Sure. Come visit us. Any other questions?
There's some questions in the chat.
In the chat.
Oh, in the chat. Okay.
Yeah. About the housing and development.
We have a question on public housing.
Is the story mapping public? I'm sure there are many wonderful lessons to be learned. So we just started the story mapping. If you're interested, you can email me. I'll put my email in the chat, and I can show you a preliminary one that we started. But yes, that's what we're working on, and Becca is like the GIS guru, so she's helping me a lot with that. But we also have a pod that has been collecting the stories. So they're collecting the stories and they're doing it through Instagram. Some of the younger ones are doing it through TikTok. So it's a lot of fun. So I'm putting it in the chat. Is there any other questions that I missed? Yvette, thank you for putting the survey in there. Awesome. Is there-
Yeah, sure.
Well, I think we're losing some people, so we probably should bring it to a conclusion now. But I want to thank everybody and certainly thank Professor Lopez-Humphreys once again. Okay. Next week, our won't have a regular talk at this time because we're having a conference about the BAM project. All of the art fellows are more than welcome from 4 to 7 on next Thursday, and then it will be all day next Friday. And you'll be receiving some information about that by email relatively shortly. So thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Great talk.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining.
I might have been a little short here, but I happen to know this gentleman's coming to take the owl away. So,
Oh, I see.
so it was that means it's time.
That's why owl goes back into the shade.
The owl goes away. What?
Oh, it's,
No, the owl does not live here. We don't have that many owls. We have a flock that's relatively small.
It is.
And it's a big university.